Well, welcome everybody. My name is Robert Cahey and I am the retiring speaker coordinator. So this is my last gig. We have a great presentation tonight. We have Steve Staiger with us, who joined the Palo Alto Historical Association in 1984 as a researcher and a historian. And he's going to take us on a trip down memory lane tonight, but it's going to be a little bit different. If you see, we've got some really high-tech stuff here that most of us in this room have probably seen and used before, but not in the last 20, 30 years with the advent of digital cameras. So it's going to be a real treat. Steve holds a degree in history from UC Davis, and he holds a Master of Library Science from the Library School at University of California, Berkeley. He joined the city of Palo Alto in 1977 as a research librarian, and after a very illustrious career, he decides to retire about 20 years ago. Lucky guy, but not one to sit still. He spent the last 40 years talking about Palo Alto to anybody that would listen to him, and helping families research their history as applies to Palo Alto and the whole Santa Clara Valley. But also for the last 25 years, he has worked tirelessly to bring a history museum to Palo Alto. And Lord willing, and the creek don't rise, it's going to open later this year, right, Steve?
Early next year now.
Early next year, that's okay. It's okay, it's been a long journey, but it is going to happen. And we're really excited about having a sister museum in Palo Alto. So please join me in welcoming Steve Staiger.
I have coordination here. Good evening. Yes, it's a Kodak carousel projector. I inherited it in the job 40 years ago, and it has failed me only once, and that's when I was in a classroom of third graders. One of my primary audiences is third grade classes. And the windows, the screens that darkened the room weren't there. Fortunately, the parent monitor for that day was the assistant director of the Palo Alto Utility Department, and he quickly darkened the room as best he could, and we went on. My primary audience over the years have been third graders, because third graders study your local community and their history, but I also talk to other groups, and so I'm thankful to be invited here tonight. I'm going to assume that most of you have been in Palo Alto at some point in your life. Maybe you lived there for a while, maybe you just go up there to do something, but you all know what it is. Palo Altans don't have a history of their community knowing it very well. The turnover is great, and so I have to sometimes explain things that I thought were pretty obvious, and they're not to the people. So we're going to run through there. This is the standard slideshow that I give to all people, like whether they're adults or children. And then at one point, based on Robert's request, I'm going to stop my normal spiel and give you something special because it deals indirectly with Sunnyvale. But for those who know, this is what El Palo Alto looked like, what are we now, 120 years ago, maybe even more. It was a double trunk tree. This is what the Spanish explorers, when they came, Portola came down out of Woodside, the hills, out on the valley floor was a redwood tree. And it was a double trunked redwood tree, which are not that common. They were amazed when they first encountered redwood trees along in southern Monterey County, kept seeing more and more of them, Santa Cruz County and up. And then, but what stood out about this one was out on the valley floor. It wasn't up in the hills. And it's the symbol for Palo Alto, obviously, Palo Alto the tree, but it's also the symbol for Stanford. Since they dropped the Indian, they now have the tree. And if you go to a football game or a basketball game, you see a Stanford student dressed up in their interpretation of the tree. I don't know that much about trees, but most of them tend to look more like maple trees or birches rather than redwoods, but that's what we got. This is a photo of, again, of the double trunk tree. And then sometime, and we only learned this recently when a new board member researched it and came up with the exact date. And I don't have the exact date in my head, but sometime in the 1880s, one of the trunks fell down. Well, no one made note of it because there wasn't a Palo Alto yet. There was a town of Mayfield, which we'll talk about. And so it just happened. But today it's a single trunk tree. It keeps, like many older people, other older things, it keeps getting shorter and shorter and shorter because it's over 900 years old. But it's still there and it's treated, the city goes out and checks it up all the time, and the Stanford students don't climb up it anymore. They did that in the early days of Stanford. This is a view of what is now downtown Palo Alto with the railroad Southern Pacific going north. You can see El Palo Alto in the horizon, and crossing there is University Avenue and what became known as the Circle, which was Palo Alto's interpretation of the town square. And really it wasn't a circle, it was a semicircle, but because it was only on the east side of the tracks. But this was the town meeting place. If you were going to have people visiting you, you would meet them at the Circle because they came to Palo Alto usually on the train, and then you would walk back a few blocks to your home. Another view of early Palo Alto. Again, this is in the 1890s, or even maybe late 1880s, as the town began to grow. Lumberyard on University Avenue. Real estate prices don't allow that today, but that's when it was there. We should say that Palo Alto was created to be the college town for Stanford. Do I need to review the history of Stanford? And you all know pretty much. Leland Jr. dies. His parents create a university in their memory. They want a college town, and they want a dry college town. So they had Timothy Hopkins lay out a brand new town, the town of Palo Alto, where you could not sell or manufacture liquor. That did not mean you couldn't have it. So the two stories that I like to tell, and they get chuckles, so you get prepared to chuckle, is the Stanford professor who lives in Professorville is told to get to the station quickly because his box of books is leaking. And then the other is a man living in Palo Alto is told, he finds out his wife's feeling ill and the doctor prescribes a bottle of champagne. Well, he can't get a bottle of champagne in Palo Alto. So he walks up and crosses a pedestrian bridge into Menlo Park and walks up to Timothy Hopkins' house, which is where the Menlo Park Civic Center is today. Timothy Hopkins was the one who founded Palo Alto. Pounds on the door in the middle of the night and words to the effect of, "God damn it, give me a bottle of champagne." And Timothy Hopkins says, "Just a moment," goes down to his cellar, pulls out a bottle and gives it to him and goes back to bed. It wasn't his law. It was the Stanford's law to try to save the children at Stanford and the community from alcohol. Well, because this is where the problems of alcohol were not controlled. This was the town of Mayfield. Mayfield dates back much earlier. All the streets were, not all, but many of them were named after generals of the Civil War. So you have Sherman, Sheridan, and they even had a street named for Lincoln, the general's general, but that changed. And this is what Mayfield was like. It was a town that served the farmers around it. It also served the lumbermen, so the Woodside and all those places. On Friday, all of these guys would come into town, drink and have a good time, spend their money, and then go home. So this is what the Stanfords were trying to protect themselves from, or protect their students from. Again, as I mentioned, one of the main industries in the northern part of the town, county was lumbering. The hills were full of redwood trees, and that's where you get Woodside, although that's in San Mateo County, and Redwood City, where these logs were cut down, milled, and then floated on barges up to San Francisco, because if you know your San Francisco history, it kept burning. and they needed to rebuild it on a regular basis. This is the Robles family home, which was a home in the south part of Palo Alto, not quite down to San Antonio, but basically on Alma and a few blocks north. The Robles family, well, Mrs. Robles, let's give the credit to her too, had 29 children. Some of her daughters didn't follow their mother as closely, and they had less than 20, but they had lots of children, and this was their house, an adobe house, a great party house for the Spanish-speaking people of what became Palo Alto. Unfortunately, in 1906, it collapsed in an earthquake. But this is Palo Alto, hayfields. You didn't have the irrigation to grow other crops, but you could grow hay. And this is a view looking on a hill behind College Terrace, which is a neighborhood of Mayfield. Two farmers subdivided it and began to sell homes to the people who were living in Mayfield and growing. The community was growing. Leland Stanford wanted to buy it, but never could. So if you look at Stanford University today, it goes all around College Terrace from El Camino Real around to El Camino Real. And College Terrace never was part of Stanford. I don't know how many of you realize Stanford is a college campus of over 8,000 acres. It's huge, although it's not the largest one. There's someone in Georgia or something that's like 19,000 acres, but I've never heard of it. But Stanford is in land that's in Palo Alto, is in Menlo Park, Portola Valley, Woodside, and I'm not sure about Los Altos Hills. This is Uncle Jim's cabin, one of those first buildings in the town of Mayfield. When you only have a few buildings, each building serves many different purposes. It was a hotel, it was the post office, but it was also a saloon, so it served as many purposes.
Where was Mayfield?
Oh, thank you for the question. Mayfield is basically centered on what we now call California Avenue, which was called Lincoln, and El Camino Real, which was called Main Street. Thank you that's a good question to ask at this point. So a drawing of the time period, but showing the train coming into what is now Palo Alto. Oh, this is where I'm going to stop and try to tell a story. This is the Barron Mansion, which is in the Barron Park neighborhood of Palo Alto today, except the house isn't there. It burned in the 20s when it caught fire. The Palo Alto fire department came down and watched it burn because it wasn't in Palo Alto and they weren't allowed to fight it. It was an unincorporated county. But that could be one of the reasons why Barron Park didn't become part of Palo Alto for another 50 years after that. But this is the story of Sarah Armstrong Montgomery Green Wallace. Those are all of her names. She married 3 times. She came over with the Murphy people on the wagon train. She was a young, maybe 18 or 19-year-old bride of a gunsmith who came with the party. They arrived safely in California. He went off with John C. Fremont and others to fight in the Bear Flag Revolt. Meanwhile, she's sitting at Sutter's Fort with nothing to do, but she discovered another woman teaching her young daughter how to read, and Sarah picked up the skill of reading. She did not know how to read or write when she came to California. Her husband disappears. They think he may have sailed off in a ship that sank. He may have sailed off to Hawaii and left her or whatever. So she meets a guy named Talbot Green in San Francisco and marries him. He's a local politician and financier. And lo and behold, it's discovered that that's not his real name. He's using an alias. He's from Philadelphia and he absconded with lots of money and left a wife and children at home. So she divorces him, and then she marries Joseph Wallace, Wallis, who was a Santa Clara County good guy. And she buys the property that's now known as Barron Park, and they live there, and she's got a good life. She becomes involved with the women's suffrage movement, and for a while was the president of the California chapter. Elizabeth Stanton and Susan B. Anthony visited her in, I want to get the year right, 1871, and former President U.S. Grant visited her in 1877. But her investments in the whatever went bad, and she lost her fortune, and she had to move to a smaller house in Mayfield. Her husband died, and then she became a pauper and was living in Los Gatos, and then she died at that point. Her son was he was one time the state librarian. That's why I have a fondness for him. I like librarians. And arranged to have her buried at Union Cemetery in Redwood City. So that's the story of Sarah Armstrong Montgomery Green Wallace. Now back to the regular show. Frenchman's Tower, Frenchman's Castle. Out on Old Page Mill Road. How many of you have seen it? Oh, very good. Can you solve the mystery of why Peter Coots built it? I tell all my audiences that if you can solve that mystery and prove it, I can make you famous. Third graders are enchanted with that idea, and afterwards, most of the questions are, maybe he did this, maybe did this. But Peter Coots was a Frenchman who may have absconded with some funds. He got mixed up in what happened after the Franco-Prussian War and came to the United States with his wife and children. And he came to the outskirts of Mayfield. And he became a dairy farmer. His cows won gold medals for their butter at the state fair, all sorts of things. And then suddenly the political climate in France allowed him to go back, and he left and sold his property to his neighbor, Leland Stanford. So the tower is still there. It's on Old Page Mill Road. So if you drive the main road off of 280, you'll miss it. But if you get off of 280 on Page Mill Road and then take the little Old Page Mill Road, you'll drive by this tower. And if you're inspired to come up with an idea, and I don't think it deals with aliens, we can talk about whether you're going to become famous or not. This is the Greer House. Captain Greer was a Scotch-Irish sea captain who came into California during the gold rush with a shipload of stuff and a crew. The crew all jumped ship to go hunt for gold, and he didn't have anything to do, so he just hopped in. He happened to have a small sailboat on his boat. He sailed down south of the San Francisco Bay and went up an inlet until his boat was too shallow for him, and got out, and in the distance he saw a light. And he walked toward it, and he met the love of his life. And so he married her, and this is the story of one of the families in Palo Alto, the Greers. This was where Town and Country Shopping Center is today. And I mean, it was there until the early 50s, even when the circus came to town and performed in its yard. I'm not going to go too much into the story of the Stanfords, but Jane and Leland were living in San Francisco after living in Sacramento, and when he built the railroad and all that. And he just bought land down on the peninsula and nurtured several of his hobbies, one of which was breeding racehorses. He was very proud of that and very successful. But again, he just went overboard with many of his things, and instead of having a 20-acre estate or a 250-acre estate, his ended up being 8,000 acres. And then suddenly, again, I think most of you know the story of Leland's death in Europe and the decision to come back to California and to dedicate this land on the peninsula to a university in memory of their son for the children of California. Oh, we'll get there in a moment. So it was tuition free. So people came from all over the Western US to come to this place. And they made a deal of it, obviously. But again, racing horses, and racehorses were trotters. The jockey sat on a cart or whatever that thing is behind the horse. He did not ride on the horse. And his horses held all of the world's records at one time in all the different categories. But he also had this theory that a horse could fly. This is what I tell the third graders. And you can't see it with your naked eye, but he had a photographer, Edward Muybridge, come in and take a series of photographs. And one of those, the horse, for a brief millisecond, is flying. So, and I think it's the third on the right, but yeah, someplace over. The thing is that this on the Stanford campus, over near the driving range, there's one of the California State historic rocks, acknowledging the birthplace of motion pictures as being on the Stanford campus, and that's because of this experiment. If your father is one of the 4 owners of the Southern Pacific, this is your toy railroad in your summer home on what is now the Stanford campus. And of course, visiting in Greece, he became ill. They took him to Florence, which was the best medical care, and he died there a few days later. And that was when the decision was to dedicate that land to the children of California. Again, you need a college town, and Palo Alto got that name. And here's an invitation, 1888, to come and check out the place. This is the circle. So the railroad tracks are at your back. You're looking down University Avenue, dirt roads. Every form of transportation is visible there. You have pedestrians, you have a horse and carriage, and you have the bicycle. The bicycle grew up with Palo Alto and the university, and the problems with riding on the wooden sidewalks was an issue, but because the muddy streets could be bad for bicycling, but it was very popular. John Parkinson's owned a lumber yard in town, but when you only have a few towns, each building has to serve many different purposes. This building was his office for his lumber yard, but it was also the post office and the first telephone company office. And today this house was moved about, well, not today. Today it lies 6 blocks away, and it's a house just north of University Avenue. This is Nordtree Hall, there's a furniture store on the first floor, but the upstairs is a big open room. That's where churches would meet until they had their own church facility. The town government met there, and there would also be entertainment, musicals. Maybe some guy talking about local history might come there, and you'd come up there and check them out. The building was torn down and replaced by a market where in the 1970s, Mrs. Fields cookies were available for sale there. But the building today, the spot is most known for, that's where the Apple computer store on University Avenue is today. When you have a lot of horses, you need a blacksmith. Blacksmiths are very important people in a town. This is one of the shops in town. And this is one of the guys, this is George Harms, who was an early blacksmith, who gets credit in my talk for being a blacksmith. This is Anna Shockey. She was an early resident in town. She and her husband had bought property, And then they were living in Santa Clara and he died. And so she and her children moved to Palo Alto and built a house on the land that they had purchased. And she's realized that we had enough kids in Palo Alto that they didn't have to send them to Mayfield, that they could have enough to have their own school. So she's the godmother, if you will, of the Palo Alto schools. And this is the first schoolhouse that the town built. This is one that I'd like to talk to the students about, because this is a hotel on Alma across from the train depot. But is a hotel, but there was a period where upstairs, one of the hotel rooms was a classroom because the kids were outgrowing that previous two-room school. And so a bunch of kids got to go to school in a hotel. Kids think that's kind of cool. The train heading north to San Francisco is stopping at the depot when it's on the Palo Alto rather than the Stanford side of the tracks. Again, the circle, which is our town square, it was a semicircle, but this is where if your friends were coming down from San Francisco or coming up from Sunnyvale, they would take the train, get off, and you would either meet them with a horse and wagon or maybe just walk and then walk to your home because it wasn't that far away. The reason you took the train everywhere is because this was El Camino Real, the dirt road. It was okay if you only had to go down to Mayfield or over to Menlo Park, but any considerable distance, it was a miserable place to go. This is an even more miserable place to travel because this is Embarcadero Road. It wasn't maintained by anybody. This is early 1900s going out toward the bay. It was the southern edge of the town, or the original town. This is Mayfield. So this is the California Avenue train station location today. And this is the most significant snowstorm in Palo Alto's history. I'll show you another one later, but it doesn't meet 1887. The snow was so heavy that it stayed on the ground for several days. I don't know how Sunnyvale doesn't go up into the hills. Palo Alto owns the snowplow today. And they're not just planning for the possibility. It snows in Palo Alto almost every year because Palo Alto goes all the way up to Skyline. And they get a light dusting. It's not an impressive amount of snow. So they've got a plow that they can hitch to the front of a four-wheel drive pickup truck because we got some very wealthy and influential people who live up there and they can't get out if the city doesn't plow the streets for them. Bicycling grew up with Palo Alto and popularity everywhere, whether it's racers or high-wheelers riding down Main Street in Mayfield, which is El Camino Real today. But they would ride Sunnyvale down to San Jose, and the roads weren't very good. This is my favorite photograph in our entire collection of over 16,000 images because I like baseball. This is the Mayfield baseball team. As I tell the third graders, you can't tell whether they won the game today or not because they don't look like they did, but the photographer has to make them be still. And it's much easier to frown or be serious than it is to smile for the length of time in the camera in those days. This is the University Brass Band of this town of Mayfield. The highlight of their career was when President Teddy Roosevelt came to visit Stanford and they were at the station to greet him when he came off the train. So 2 years after Stanford opens, Leland dies. He was a very unhealthy, grossly overweight man, and everyone assumed the university would shut down because it had only been operating for 2 years. But remember, James son was the one that it was named for. It wasn't named for the father, it was named for the son. And she pulled out all the strings and refinanced things and kept the university going because California's children were her children now. The town continues to grow, more and more two-story buildings. This is University Avenue. This is a reading room, which is a predecessor to a library. You can go there and read books and magazines, but they didn't have very many of them, so you couldn't check them out. In 1904, we got a Carnegie Library in town. Carnegie didn't, well, I don't think it was the guy Carnegie. I think his team determined that Palo Alto really wasn't going to make it or something, so they only gave us half the money. But so we could build the building, but they didn't give us any money for books, but we already had the books because we had a reading room. So this was the Carnegie Library. It's where our lovely city hall is today. It was torn down in the 60s to replace, yes, I see a nod. Well, that was the wrong decision. Many of us agree with you. It's much more attractive than our city hall. Fred Smith, one of the early residents in town, out for a drive in one of the early automobiles. Third graders don't really think this is an automobile, but it is. This is Fred Smith's shop at the circle where the University Avenue hits the tracks. And in addition to sporting goods stuff, he did sell automobiles there. 1906, earthquake damage all through Northern California. Most of the damage in Palo Alto was from facades falling into the street. And structurally, the building was there. There were a couple buildings that fell down. And then in the residential neighborhood, chimneys fell down, but no serious injuries of that nature. This is one of the exceptions. This was a private school before and after, but of course the earthquake was at 5-something in the morning. So there were no students hurt in this. The entrance gates to Stanford, before and after. Okay, when Leland died, Jane went on what some people call the Stone Age. She just went on a massive building thing, and she did not take the care to build her new buildings on proper foundations. So most of what Stanford's damage was buildings that Jane had built, and not the original ones. So she had a new gymnasium that never opened, but it was collapsed. She had an arch that honored her son and husband, and the memorial church, the spire, collapsed and blew out the front of the building. These are people in Palo Alto reading newspaper accounts of what was happening elsewhere in California. Again, we didn't have the internet or even television and radio, but newspapers would publish the news. And it's reported that that you could read a newspaper outside in Palo Alto from the fires in San Francisco. Don't know if it's true, but that's what someone reported. But they're just reading a newspaper that's been posted on the wall. John Parkinson was the mayor of Palo Alto during the 1906 earthquake, and he organized relief parties to send bread and milk and other stuff up to San Francisco. Palo Alto's damage was very minor. There were 2 fatalities on the Stanford campus, none in Palo Alto. Later in 1906, Palo Alto celebrated the opening of the streetcar line. And on opening day, the young female church members collected the money, the nickel for the ride, and it all went to charity. But this is the streetcar, it ran down University Avenue. Eventually, it went on to the Stanford campus and went into East Palo Alto until San Mateo County wanted more money to go into their territory, so they pulled it back up to the creek. But there was also, well, we're going to get to another one. But this is opening day, 1906. So, the earthquake was 6 months earlier, but a balloon ascension, someone jumping out of a balloon, that was pretty spectacular stuff for a small town. One of the most distinctive things about Palo Alto is it might be the fact that there's no PG&E in Palo Alto. It's all city utilities, and this was one of those things, a power plant pumping water up to a tank to supply water. 1910, the new train station, which was the first one on the Stanford side of the tracks. Around again the same period, if you drove down the car and you met another car, you would stop and, how's your car running? What type of mileage? Where do you get good gas? Again, the town continuing to grow, more and more two-story buildings. 1914, electric lights. Wow. Over University Avenue, you can see them reflecting off the streetcar lines, rails. Here's a Palo Alto Fire Department, and in the middle is a brand new fire engine. On the right were a fire carriage, and I asked the third graders, how did that fire carriage get to the fire? Horses, very good guess, but wrong. In a large city like San Francisco, you had horses ready 27. The firemen would, they only had to pull it 2 or 3 blocks. It didn't have to go very far, but they would hear the bell and they would run and pull it to the fire. It wasn't a bad guess. The next couple photos are some of the early houses that are still around the town. This was a residence, but now it's an office building. This is a Bernard Maybeck designed sunbonnet house on Bryant. The Squire House, which Mr. Squire was the heir to a meatpacking fortune in Boston, but chose to live in California. And he was the official weatherman for many years. His weather reports were observed at his house on the 900 block of University Avenue. City officials in front of standing on a fire truck in front of City Hall. This was a residence north of University Avenue, but in, I forgot the year. It's early 1900s, there was a typhoid epidemic affecting mostly Stanford students. And the Stanford student body and others made use of this as a temporary hospital, because there was no hospital in Palo Alto at that point. This is later is the hospital. It's out where the Bowling Green is today. It wasn't built very well, and they eventually tore it down and built the Hoover Pavilion on the campus. World War I, U.S. Army training camp, Camp Fremont. Most of it was in Menlo Park, but they used the Stanford grounds to fire their artillery and march around and all of that. And well, the most interesting thing is they had a hostess house on the camp, on the base, that was financed by the YWCA, and they built them at camps all over the country. This was a place where the soldiers could correctly interact with the women in their life. That meant their mothers, their wives, their girlfriends, and maybe their children, not the other women in their life. And so Camp Fremont had one. And after the war was over, again, the war didn't last very long. They moved it to Palo Alto, and it became a veterans and community center. And today it's the MacArthur Park restaurant. The same, again, Julia Morgan designed both of the hostess houses in California. The other one was in San Diego area. This is the children. No, this is the I don't want to say adult theater. The theater at the Lucy Stern Community Center. Normally, when I give these talks, I wear my blue jeans, my Levi's. I'm wearing Dockers, so I'm sort of in it. Lucy Stern was one of the heirs of the Levi Strauss fortune. She was the widow of one of Levi Strauss's nephews. And so she had lots of money. She was living in a mansion in Atherton, and her doctor urged her to sort of get out more. And so he had her they built a house for her in Palo Alto. And she had a daughter who had epilepsy and was essentially a 12-year-old the rest of her life mentally. And so built a second house next door for her and a third house for a guardian nurse type of thing. And she had so much fun building these things, and she had gobs of money, that she said, what else can we do? So she built the community theater, the two wings. She liked boys over girls, so the Boy Scouts got lots of things. And well, but this is one of the benefits. And here's a picture of her. This was the police fire building. It also had a courthouse and a jail. Today it's one of the senior centers north of University Avenue. But you can see all the fire trucks and the police motorcycles, and police cars there. This is the Palo Alto Airport when it was on the Stanford campus, where Escondido Village is today. And so if you were a Stanford alum living in, let's say, Fresno, it would take you hours to get to Palo Alto to watch a home game. But if you had either chartered a plane, or if you were a pilot, you could get there in an hour and a half maybe. So they would land here, go to the football game and back. The residents of College Terrace objected to all of these planes flying low over their houses in order to land at this. So the solution was the city was going to move the airport out to the Baylands, where there was nobody but ducks and other things. They just picked up the hangars and dragged them out Embarcadero Road, and that was the end of this airport. Again, the town square, which is the circle. In 1941, it disappears when they built the underpass under the railroad and over El Camino Real. So this is sometime shortly thereafter. This is the most famous automobile garage in the world, and it's in Palo Alto. David Packard and his wife lived on the ground floor of this house on the right. Their landlady lived upstairs. Hewlett was a bachelor, and he lived in literally a shack out in the back to the right of the garage. But it's in the garage where they started doing their stuff, and now everybody wants to do their stuff in a garage at least some point in their career. This house has a big state historic rock in front of it, and I was there the day that they unveiled the rock, and at the end of the block, the big limo stopped, and Hewlett and Packard got out and walked down there very slowly, because by this time they're old men. And one of them is reported to have said, "Now, which house was it?" It wasn't that big a deal to them. It was a cheap place to live, I think. But so it is one of the. I don't think it's as popular now as it was maybe 20 years ago. I mean, they used to have tour buses stop, and you'd get all these Japanese male tourists with cameras around their neck coming over and taking pictures of it. It's still there. The garage is still there. It's actually owned by HP now. 1962, more snow in Palo Alto. I grew up in southern Marin, so snow's kind of exciting to me. This is Snowman. This is on the grounds of what is now the Art Center. That was City Hall in 1962. Of course, other people here recognize this? Yes. Oh. Well, the termites beat you out. The building became a hazard because it was dry rot and termites. So Lake Lagunitas is still there. It fills up in the wintertime with water, but no recreational activities are permitted unless you're a duck. Remember the old Carnegie Library? Well, can you imagine Palo Alto tore down that lovely building to build this? This is a city hall. No, the pool hall was next to the library, on the same block. Yeah, they tore down the pool hall and the library to build this.
I used to go there for haircuts.
Palo Alto, used to have a swell yacht harbor, but it had a problem with dredging. So, city solution, well, why a dredge? And so the city owned a dredge, and it would scoop up all the mud and dump it off on the side, and that was all dandy. And then they discovered that what they were dumping on the side banks had toxic metals in it from the Stanford Industrial Park. So they couldn't dump them from there anymore. The state or federal government said you could put them on a barge and take them out the Golden Gate Bridge out to the Farallones and dump them. That's legal, but you can't dump them on there. So they stopped dredging, and gradually all the sailboats had to leave, and then the big power boats had to leave. And today, stand-up paddleboard or maybe a kayak is about all you can put out there. This is an example of the city's utility. This is the water tower on Alma and Hawthorne. And actually, I think sometime later this month, it's going to be renamed for a city council member who helped preserve it. They had a contest years ago. What are you going to do with this large monstrosity? I heard someone say. And Roxy Rapp, I don't know if you know him. He's a Palo Alto resident. His idea was to make a hotel out of it. Nothing came of it. It's still there today. The problem with it is it's so well built. It's too expensive to tear down. It hasn't been used. I've been in Palo Alto since the 70s, and it wasn't used as a water tower then, and hasn't been used since. It's on Alma. I think this is my second to last slide, so we're almost over. These are some Palo Alto Boy Scouts on a march or a parade in Santa Cruz around 1910 with the slogan, "Keep your eye on Palo Alto." I leave you with, maybe some of you, did you ever go to the Palo Alto Medical Clinic on Homer? This is what this is. It's still there today. The clinic moved out in the late 90s, out to El Camino Real. The building sat vacant for a while. The city bought it, and I've been spending 25 years of my life trying to make this into a history museum. But we got the rights to do it. Vance Brown Builders have done all the work. It's a gorgeous building. We now just have to make a museum out of it. The archives will also go into it on the second floor. Burge Clark, who was our town architect, designed this building. One of the reasons I think he got the job was his sister was one of the 6 physicians for the clinic in the beginning. I think that's the end.
Thank you.
We want questions, comments? He says yes. Anybody have a question?
Was the Hopkins you were talking about in the beginning one of the big 4, that Hopkins? Or was it just a different Hopkins?
Oh, okay, repeat the question. He says, is that Hopkins you were mentioning, was he one of the big 4? And I don't think so. Well, I think what I was referring to was Timothy Hopkins. Timothy Hopkins was born to 2 Irish immigrants from Maine who came to California. The father came first, got things established. His wife and 3 children left. And when he saw the boat coming into the San Francisco harbor, he got so excited, jumped into the water, and then realized he didn't know how to swim. So, 2 hours later, she gets off the boat and discovers she's a widow. She found a job with the Hopkins in Sacramento. The railroad people were still in Sacramento. And her Oldest son became unofficially a member of the family. The other one didn't, and he later got into drugs, and he was kind of messed up. But Timothy was, Mark Hopkins never adopted him, but when he died, his widow did. And so he had that fortune. Plus, he worked for the Southern Pacific. So he lived where the Menlo Park Civic Center is today. And he had a large estate where he grew all sorts of fruits and flowers for the San Francisco market. And yeah.
So what street is the Palo Alto?
It's on Homer at Bryant, 300 Homer. There's a heritage park as part of the Gold Clinic site. Yeah, let's give them a call out. Across from the Museum of American Heritage, which could be in any town in the United States, but it's in Palo Alto.
What became of James Stanford?
What became of, I think he's done. If I don't tell the quick answer. Jane Stanford continued to live, obviously, for a while. She died in 1905. She died in Honolulu. She died of strychnine poisoning. I'm giving you the facts. 4 possibilities. Someone in her household intentionally poisoned her. Someone accidentally poisoned her. She accidentally poisoned herself. She intentionally poisoned herself. Those are the facts. They couldn't, yeah. Well, the Stanford University people went over there, including Timothy Hopkins, who was a trustee, and just tried to quiet it down. They didn't want the possibility that she may have killed herself. She was very old. She lost her son, now lost her husband, and yeah, it's fortunate that she died in 1905, so she didn't see the damage of the 1906 earthquake. Yeah. Yes.
Can you describe the murals that are at the new museum? Because they're really interesting.
The murals at the new museum. Okay. Victor Arnautoff, who was a disciple of Diego Rivera, was hired by Russell Lee, who was the main head doctor, and he was a guy who wanted to be different, and he was. And so he commissioned him to create these murals, these panels. I think there are 4 of them, you know, documenting the history of medicine. And they're gorgeous, and they've been preserved. The city is really keeping good care of them. One of the murals happens to have a bare-breasted adult female with a doctor with a stethoscope on her back, I think. Nothing, but yeah, but it's what, so a San Francisco newspaper reported this scandalous thing in their Saturday edition. Sunday after church, the first recorded traffic jam in Palo Alto's history was people driving down Homer Avenue, checking this thing out for themselves. So you can check it out for yourself today. You can tell you what, it's pretty tame, but it's. Any other questions? Way in the back.
Steve Jobs' house, wherever they are here, Palo Alto.
Yes.
Do you have any information about that? We visited that here 2 weeks ago with some friends. I just read the mention, but maybe you have a presentation about it.
No, because it's the security on the house is as intense now as it ever was. Yeah. And he's buried out at Alta Mesa Cemetery. He replaced Pigpen from the Grateful Dead as the most commonly sought grave site to visit. Alta Mesa, over out near Gun High School. Pigpen was for years the most. There used to be a website called Find a Grave that would list the 10 most famous people buried in every cemetery. Pigpen made that list. But now it's Steve Jobs. He's got the title. Yes?
Where does Palo Alto come from?
That's a good question. Where does the name Palo Alto come from? Comes from tall stick, tall tree. Remember the Spanish coming through there were amazed at redwood trees. There's nothing like a redwood tree in Spain, nothing like it in Mexico. And starting in Monterey, they just saw these things. And then they saw this one, they camped near it. They didn't camp under it, but they were there. And the fact that it was out on the valley floor made it stand out even more so than, you know, hundreds of other trees up there. And so that's become the symbol. And Palo Alto took its name from there. The city spends a lot of money watching that tree. So if you've got any evil ideas, I would go someplace else. Yes.
Any interesting stories on the annexation of Mayfield?
Any interesting stories? Well, okay, the two towns were separate, but they were growing together. They were starting to share the same school district. And Palo Alto just had more things going for it than Mayfield, because what drove Mayfield in the 1870s and 1880s wasn't as valid in the 1920s. I was going to say something. Oh no, I forgot. Look, the most memorable things. When you combine two cities, you have duplicate street names. And what do? Palo Alto took the thing as our street name, even though it's newer, is the dominant one. Well, all the main streets in downtown Mayfield were named after Civil War generals. Lincoln's not there, but Sherman, Sheridan, Grant. Lincoln was lost out because Palo Alto has a residential street, Lincoln. Yes, but so they had to rename it, and they named it California Avenue. That was Lincoln. Oh yes, that was the one that got the priority over it. Everything, and some of them were little streets in Palo Alto no one could find, but they lost to Palo Alto.
Was that area also ever called Fremont?
Sort of, yes. Fremont is a township. As best I can determine, townships were used throughout the West as a subdivision of a county. And so Fremont Township was essentially the northern portion of Santa Clara County. So it was the name. Someone just gave us a map of Fremont Township, and it's got Mayfield there. No Palo Alto, because Palo Alto didn't exist yet, and it includes. I'm not sure how far down it goes. Probably not to here, but it might include Mountain View. I don't recall, but it was a legal thing just to divide the county up into segments that could be maybe administered easily. I don't really know. Well, thank you very much.